Savannah, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats podcast. We're so happy to have you here today, and we're going to ask you to make a few opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, thank you for having me. This is a fun opportunity. So we thought that a good topic for today would be checks and balances. But we can't access or understand checks and balances unless we view the Constitution systematically. We have to view it in its place in the document. So first, what is the point of the US Constitution? What are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to create a strong, effective, and also limited government. And this is a point I think we miss when we talk about the Constitution, that we're not just creating a limited government, we're creating a strong and effective government. Because weak government, ineffective government, is as dangerous to liberty as authoritarian government. So they didn't create a weak federal government here. They created a powerful federal government. And you can see this in the construction of the three branches. So Article 1, the legislature. Article 2, the executive. Article 3, the judiciary. The most limited institution in our government is actually the legislature. It, for example, is only given all powers herein granted. The sacred legislative orb is not just given to Congress to do what they will with. Instead, they are limited to, here are the things you are allowed to legislate on. Compare that to the executive. The executive is simply vested with the executive power. The sacred executive orb, if you will, is just handed over. And then same thing with the judiciary. So you have three truly co-equal, powerful branches of government. And that second branch helps us understand, in particular, the necessity of checks and balances. So the state constitutional period taught us a lot of really hard and important lessons. Basically, how do you make democracy work where it has failed everywhere else previously? And they thought the answer is separation of powers. So we'll have a legislature, we'll have an independent judiciary, so we'll have a branch that makes the law, a branch that adjudicates on the basis of the law, and with the exception of Pennsylvania, we'll also have an executive, someone who administers the law. But in all of these cases, except for maybe New York, the executive was weak, pretty ineffective, irrelevant, basically. And it led to disastrous outcomes in the states, an inability to handle crisis, an inability to effectively govern. So John Locke's theory on separation of powers, I guess I should say Montesquieu's theory on separation of powers, isn't enough. It's not enough to just divide power out and say that'll do it. You need to create three powerful branches. We need a president, in other words. That's what we learn. We need crisis government, and crisis government comes from an executive. So how do you create an executive without spiraling into tyranny? And of course, you also fear legislative tyranny. So how do you keep each of these powerful branches separate and powerful enough to be effective without devolving into tyranny? And the answer is checks and balances. So the way to think about this, how I think about it at least, is I create in my mind three spheres. One, L, E, and J, separation of powers. To understand checks and balances, I want you to overlap them like a Venn diagram. There are overlapping powers between each of the branches, things that the executive can do that is also kind of legislative in function, things that the legislature can do that really gets on the toes of the judiciary. So you overlap them. These gray areas are areas that you are intended to fight over. You want the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches at each other's throats. You want them fighting. And the way they fight is with offensive and defensive weapons provided by the US Constitution. In other words, each branch has weapons to use against the other branch, to keep the other branches from encroaching on their territory. So just think of one example of this. The president is obviously the head of the executive branch. You can agree on that. And yet he must get the advice and consent of the Senate for any of his cabinet level positions. that is a weapon that the Senate can use against the executive branch. Another weapon that the legislative branch has against the executive is the budget. Congress and Congress alone controls the money in this government. Congress must declare war. So these are ways to limit the president. And likewise, the president has weapons to use against the other two branches. For example, the president can turn to Congress, say, you did a really bad job on that bill, and veto it. Now they have to get a 2/3 override. Good luck with that. The president can turn to the judiciary and say, oh, you make bad decisions. I don't like you. Well, then from then on out, as soon as someone dies or retires, he can put someone with very different constitutional views and nominate them for any of the courts with the advice and consent of the Senate. Let's say Congress thinks the judiciary sucks at their job. It is well within their prerogative to expand the size of the Supreme Court. They could expand it to 16. Say, Mr. President, find 7 new members. We'll confirm them for you. They have weapons to use against each other. The key to this system working, however, the key to checks and balances, these offensive and defensive weapons that allow each of the institutions to remain independent, strong, and not tyrannical, is institutional thinking. It's pure self-interest. That's what makes checks and balances work. You need to connect the ambition of the person to the powers of the place. In other words, you need John Thune to know that he is only as personally powerful as the United States Senate is powerful. And therefore, he will be incentivized to jealously guard the territory of the Senate from encroachments by the president or by the judiciary. You need Speaker Johnson to know that he is only as powerful as the United States Congress is powerful, and therefore to jealously guard against encroachments by the president. You need incoming President Trump to know that he is only as powerful as the executive branch. So in other words, this only works. Checks and balances only work. They only function if you have individuals, deeply self-interested and ambitious individuals, by the way, concerned with their own power, who as a result protect their institutions, who think more institutionally than they do as partisans. They would act first as an institutionalist than as a member of a party. And in fact, I would argue that many of the struggles we see today in American government come from a lack of institutional thinking in a historically weak Congress. A lot of kind of bowing to presidential power. So I think that's the way we can place checks and balances in our system, in the constitutional system, the way that it allows us to have strong, effective, but limited government, checks and balances.
Well, thank you. That was a great summary of checks and balances and some things I've never really heard before. Like we want the branches at each other's throats. I never thought about that, but that is really interesting. So, Janine, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hello, Savannah. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, and hello, fabulous panel and Kathy, and all of our audience and our sponsor. So thank you so much. Okay, so I love this. This is something that, we have a George Washington speaking initiative at the foundation, and we go across the country and give speeches, and we only get like 30 minutes to 40 minutes, and so we have to. So that's a little bit of time to squeeze in a lot of information about the United States Constitution. But one thing that I've been wanting to focus on more is exactly explaining what the checks and balances are, because I think a lot of times the words are thrown out like, okay, you got government when they're teaching, and they're checks and balances, but what are they and how do they work? And you just listed off quite a few, and I would love to kind of go back a little bit, like Article 1, Section this says this, and Article 2 says this. And everyone here on this panel and everyone listening that's been in our audience for a lengthy period of time knows that one of my favorite checks is Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, which is the president can't make a treaty. And I'm reading a great book right now called Paris 1919 about Woodrow Wilson going over to do the Treaty of Versailles, which was the close of World War I. And there he was with Clemenceau and Lloyd George from England, Clemenceau from France, and Italy and America. And there they were trying to make this treaty. And it's a fascinating check because Woodrow Wilson really wanted Americans to once we were going to be in the war, to participate in the war, to really be a decisive factor for the win, so that they then could be a decisive factor in the treaty. So they go over and they make this treaty. And one of the things he wants is the League of Nations. And this is just a wonderful check and balance story. I'm sure you know this, Savannah, right? So he wanted the League of Nations. He'd been talking about this for years. He was greeted as a hero in Europe because the League of Nations was going to happen. It was number one on his 14 points of what he wanted to accomplish with the League of Nations. So they do it over there. They get the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations is established, and he comes back. But Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, it has to be checked by the Senate. It has to be checked by the Senate. And so he comes back with his League of Nations, and he had a few thorns in his side in the Senate because there were a lot of people that says, we don't know if we want to be a part of this national organization. We don't know that we want to be drawn into all of these. And this is at the end of World War I, right? We don't know if we want to be drawn into all these conflicts. And so there were a few senators that did not really like the way the League of Nations treaty had been choreographed. So here's what's interesting. The president had a check. And I love this. A president can't go, of course, they change it now, Savannah, by calling it an executive agreement. And they don't have to get approval from the Senate. And that's where we, the people, have to really understand what these checks and balances are. I called a couple of senators myself once and said, wait, you need to be ratifying these treaties. Like, oh, there are just so many. And so they started calling them a different name so they don't have to be ratified anymore. But in 1919, they weren't doing that yet. So he comes up with the treaty. It has to be ratified by the Senate. And the Senate wanted to make a few changes to the League of Nations. At first, they were like, no League of Nations. And then they said, all right, well, let's just make a few changes. Do you know Woodrow Wilson didn't want any of the changes? It was like, my League of Nations from my Treaty of Versailles are bust. And the Senate said, well, we'll do it, but we want to make a few changes. And Woodrow Wilson said, no, I'm not doing it. He didn't get his League of Nations. Here is the one thing he wanted, and he didn't get it because he wasn't able to compromise. So I just love that story because it talks about the check of the Senate went over with one man and one executive branch going over to Europe to make a treaty. They can't just come back and say, okay, here it is. They have to have the approval of the Senate. So that's one thing I love. Another thing I love, and Susanna, you may, or Kathy, y'all can look up exactly where this is, but what I love that's never talked about is that if Congress does not want to create an amendment or listen to the people who want an amendment, and Congress says, no, we're not interested in limiting the budget or reducing our salaries, the people can call a convention of states and have a convention of states where they come up with an amendment. That's another wonderful check. So sorry for my long story, but I just thought that was a great example of a president being limited in the executive branch. So my question for you is, anything else that you could throw out about a check? You already threw some out, but I think it'd be cool to say this is Article 1, Section 2. This is where you get it. So it's clear for the students listening. But the other thing is executive orders. I wish there were more of a check on executive orders. It's great, if you have someone new coming in that can reverse all the stuff that you didn't like before or vice versa. But there's not much of a check on executive orders, except they can be overturned in 4 years or so. But as we go into this election, there's another check in the oath that the president reads when he's elected. So I'll give that to you to talk about the presidential oath, but also executive orders. What are your thoughts on that? And give us any more checks. And then I'm really through talking. I'm just going to toss it back to you.
Yeah, no, I actually, for a second, if it's okay, I would like to go back to Wilson and the treaty power, because there's so much more that needs to be said there to understand this this check. So you mentioned Wilson, and Wilson is remarkable for his misunderstanding of the U.S. Constitution. So Wilson is a scholar of political science. He's the president of the American Political Science Association. before he becomes president. And he creates this theory called the theory of the modern presidency, which he intellectually creates, but never fully implements because he lacks the political skill to do so. But it is implemented by FDR later. And one of the key tenets of this is basically that checks and balances are inefficient. In order to function, and we can't be a prime minister style government, which is what he really wanted, the president has to evolve. The president has to get more powerful because he believed that Article 2 incorrectly created a weak president, which it did not. So he said, I and I alone am the direct representative of the American people. When I'm selected, that means Congress should do what I say. And when Congress doesn't do what I say, like ratify the League of Nations, then I will appeal to the people using my oratorical skills and convince them to bully the Senate into doing what I want because I am the representative of the American people. So he goes on this long speaking tour, and it's a phenomenal failure for Wilson because in the end, the American people, although we become more presidential over time, we still instinctively feel this draw to Congress as the people's branch. So it's this wonderful check. It's this moment where the Senate turns to the president and says, no theory of the modern presidency here. The Senate still has foreign policy powers. But sometimes it goes the other direction. For example, the Jay Treaty, our first real fight over treaties in between the president and the Senate. So you have John Jay sent by George Washington to negotiate a treaty with the British. And he does it, brings it back, they send it to the Senate, and the Senate says, hold on, we want to know, how was the sausage made here? What are all the deals that you made? What instructions did you give John Jay when negotiating this treaty? And Washington wins this argument and says, no, I just need your advice and your consent. I give you the treaty, you say yes or no. You don't get any more information than that. And if you don't like it, impeach me, basically. So he really stands up to the Senate here and gets his way. So what you see is this constant back and forth on treaties is just one example, but on these checks between the executive and Congress. And in fact, our entire history is a swing of power between Congress and the presidency, though we don't really swing anymore. You spoke about executive agreements, which is such an interesting conversation to have. The one saving grace of executive agreements, and I'm not sure this should make us feel much better, is that what one president can do with a pen, the next president can undo by ripping up the piece of paper. You can't do that with a treaty, but you can with an executive agreement. So, Iran nuclear deal, the Paris Climate Accords, what one president does, the next president can undo. But I agree with you that the Senate has gotten weak, especially on foreign policy.
They're still pretty dangerous, one thing, Savannah, I think they're pretty dangerous, these executive agreements, because many of them just go into obscurity, into a drawer, and they're established. It's just the big ones that we hear about. And also, I'm not sure if they did a Treaty of Versailles today, they would even call it a treaty. I think they would call it a, executive agreement, so they wouldn't have to go to the Senate at all. And I don't know how we sort of stop this momentum of executive agreements. And I need to toss, so I'll have to stop my conversation. But if you'd answer that question, I mean, how do we stop executive agreements with treaties? They're kind of on the train. It's like, I don't need. They tried to do it with the big deal with that big treaty with Iran. They didn't. It wasn't. They were making a big fuss, like the Senate needs to say. I'm like, well, hello, if you'd called it a treaty instead of an executive agreement, you would have gotten that. I wonder how we curb when these kind of shady little nuances, which is why the people have to be aware, start to take precedence.
Oh, I agree. So this is a great question. And it's ultimately the question of rebalancing our constitutional order. And that is institutional thinking. That's how we get back to it. And it can't just start in Congress. Congress, they're Pavlovian. They'll respond to the people. They want re-election. That's what they truly want. And so if the people, you and me, will prioritize institutional thinking and, more importantly, reward institutional thinking with re-election and punish it by not re-electing that person, then we can teach our members of Congress to begin thinking institutionally again, which means sometimes saying no to a thing that you want because it's would endanger the power of your institution. Saying no to a president of your own party because it's being done in the wrong way. So that's going to be a big adjustment for the American people. We have to stop thinking, one is presidentially, and two, we have to stop thinking about, how do I say this? Partisan results. We have to care less about partisan results and more about constitutional. Sorry?
We have to stop about instant gratification and think more about
Oh,
delayed
that's a good way to put it. Right.
and
Yeah.
understanding what's in the Constitution. Okay, I have to toss now. Kathy, I'll toss it to you. Is it Jorn, Jewel? Who's next?
I think
Thank
we're
you,
going to go to
Savannah.
We're going to go to Jewel next, and then we're going to go to Jonah.
All right, hello, this is Jewel Gilbert with Constituting America here. I'm so happy to be on the podcast and hearing this great discussion. So I have a really big comment question to go over first. Our founders are incredible. We study them on this show. I love having you on with your the incredible knowledge that you're sharing with us. They specifically designed these institutions to, as you described, be able to compete, to be able to curb ambition with ambition. And also they were very careful at understanding, that is a careful understanding of incentives. And a concern that I guess I would think about today that may be different from the founding fathers' time or development is that government has gotten very, very big, and there is a different level of comfort and wealth that can be achieved by individuals in Congress and in different forms of government and in the administrative state. So I wonder if there has been a large change in the incentives because it's harder for that ambition to challenge each other when there's a greater ability to gain wealth from the position in government, and also with the growth of the administrative state, that there's these roles where you could have ambition and have a great amount of power, but you're not actually incentivized by the vote, because we haven't had a huge amount of like revolutionary firings in a lot of the administrative state that has held them accountable to the voters. So I don't know if that was too much at once, and I can clarify anything that you need, but please let me know what you think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So when you think about the founding generation, brilliant. And also, they missed a few things. For example, political parties. They didn't see that one coming. And it has been a defining feature of the American Republic. So they certainly missed a few things. But thinking about incentive structures, I like this. Wealth. So many of the founders, many of those who have participated in the early governments were not poor people. They were fairly prosperous, fairly stable, fairly well off. So I'm not sure that has changed, though I think the diversity, the socioeconomic diversity may have shifted in recent years and decreased. I think that's problematic. For example, I think it's problematic that you have serious underrepresentation of individuals in this country who only have a high school degree or less. I think that probably leads to bad outcomes. But incentives, the number one incentive for any politician is reelection. That's the number one incentive, even more than wealth. It's reelection, because power is even more alluring than wealth is. We have a problem with reelection incentives in this country, which is that we don't kick people out of power anymore. So if we want to re-incentivize or change the incentive structure, we need to do things like combat gerrymandering, which makes it very difficult to remove politicians. We need to take primaries and generals more seriously. If you want checks or if you want term limits, for example, they're called elections. So I think the number one way to push back, and of course there's also institutional reforms, things like insider trading in Congress, this kind of stuff. But the big reform, I think, comes from combating gerrymandering and getting more serious about kicking politicians out of office.
Yeah, is there any as we brought up the party system, and the party system also has a certain amount of effect in retaining elected officials that maybe wouldn't otherwise be elected because they have that party next to their name, but also because of the money that they're able to get for their campaigns from the party. They can focus in on different elections around the country. Is there any type of reform that may be needed as far as the way that the politicians are protected from their parties, or is it money in politics that could use reform, or do we more so need to focus the reform on the education of the population like we are attempting to do here? Or do you think that there's a structural change that may need to happen so that we can have our elections be more responsive to the political feelings in the nation?
Okay, all very interesting comments. So first, let's talk about political party strength. We do have two dominant political parties, but structurally, they're much less powerful than we think they are, especially in Congress. The political parties are actually fairly weak in terms of being able to control members. For example, neither Democrats nor Republicans at this point can, as political parties, I mean, the political party structure can really pick its presidential candidate. That's very different from, Lincoln being selected by the political party. We don't do that anymore. You can kind of have rogue individuals come in and run rampant over primaries simply because they have a lot of money or because they've built up an independent fan base. So that's quite new. So there's actually a lot of argument among political scientists. Do we need stronger political parties? Do we need more political parties? And that only happens if you have a proportional representation system. How do we handle political parties? I tend to favor the idea that weak political parties are actually a problem for us, which leads us to money in politics. So again, this is another thing political scientists just argue over constantly. What do you do about money in politics? Well, of course, there have been some Supreme Court decisions that have been made that lead to an influx of cash into the political system. There are some reforms that people have suggested, and I'll just list some and discard them as you see fit. One of them is publicly financed elections. So instead of having members of Congress have to spend 2 to 4 hours every single day leaving the Capitol building, walking down to their party headquarters, sitting in a booth and calling members in their district asking for money so that they can be reelected, instead, why not try publicly funded elections, wherein each candidate who qualifies above a certain percentage gets X amount of dollars and X amount of dollars alone to spend on an election. This would allow people who aren't as wealthy to enter in, would decrease the money pressure on members of Congress. But of course, people would say, but now I have to pay for it. And in a way, you already kind of do pay for it. So there's one option, take or discard as you will. Other options include removing super PACs from the equation, overturning Citizens United. There's actually, I think, a big argument to be made that we should actually increase the pay for staff members in Congress and maybe even members of Congress. People aren't going to like that, but I think there's maybe an argument to be made there for that as well. But what you're talking about is so interesting because Alexander Hamilton spends a lot of time in the Federalist Papers wrestling with the idea of money and how it can control members of Congress. And so he's arguing, okay, you've got to pay members of Congress, you've got to pay them well so they're not controlled by these money interests. You can't let them control the president's salary because he who controls your salary controls you, the whole thing. So man, you're bringing up so many interesting things. And then finally, education. I actually think this is a huge one. I think constitutional illiteracy leads to a lot of the problems that we have today. And for me, that means institutional knowledge. You have to know, what does Congress do? What does the president do? And most importantly, what can I do when one of the branches is seeping out of its boundaries? What should I expect? What can I do to put it back in its place? Which will require thinking less about the American president. So I'm sorry, there's a grab bag of responses to you, but you just bring up so many interesting things.
No, that was amazing. That was great. Thank you for tackling each of those. So my final one will be, I pretty much always err on the side of limited government and limited powers, and thinking that maybe some of the best way to let things handle themselves is government getting out of the way. Do you think that some of these issues, though, require government asserting itself in some way before we'd be able to? Do you think the government would need to spearhead the reform, or that they would need to pull back and allow the reform to take place if we're talking about all of this myriad of different things and different ways that we could attempt to increase our checks and balances and the powers of get back to maybe the executive and the Congress and the judicial really fighting for their place in the power structure of our government?
Okay, just so I understand you correctly, is what you're talking about something like if you have a problem with this sheer size and scope of the administrative state under the direction of, primarily under the direction of the presidency, something like Congress having more staff, more capacity to conduct oversight of the administrative state, the way the president is leading. Is this what you're talking about?
I'm thinking more of regulations, thinking more of additional laws or regulations that may have Congress cut the executive, or have the executive even, I can't think of some way that the executive branch would do this, but in a way that the executive would enforce some type of regulation that would affect Congress more directly.
Interesting. Okay. I guess my quick answer to this would be there's no scenario in which government makes itself smaller. That's not what government does. Government does not, that's not the incentive structure, right? The incentive structure is to get bigger. And I would never look to the president to decrease the president's own power. So if you want to compete against what is a colossal American presidency today, you need to increase the capacity of Congress, which actually means, and again, people aren't going to like this, making Congress bigger. And I don't just mean in terms of in terms of number of representatives, which is just an arbitrary cap from like 1919 or something, but actually increasing the staff and the pay for the staff so that they can conduct oversight. So for example, the Government Accountability Office sends thousands of pages of reports on executive agencies. Here's the regulations they are passing. Here's how they're using their budget. Here's how they are or are not doing what Congress wanted them to do according to the law. And then they send them to Congress. And I know this because I was there. No one reads it. No one reads it because you're super overworked and underpaid and you just don't have the capacity to do it. So there's really no oversight, bureaucratic oversight. So if you want the essential institution to beef up is Congress. You have to have a stronger, meatier, more powerful Congress, and that will require more staff, more funding. That's a way to decrease potentially the size of the executive branch if that's what you want.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. We went a little long, and sorry, Jonah. We can get to your great questions now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jonah. Savannah, thank you again for coming on to the show today. I've found the conversation to be very interesting, but I do want to go more to like how big our government has become. I just, as a basic question, how is checks and balances, how do they play out on the lower levels of government, like agencies?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so let's think about the Environmental Protection Agency. So the EPA is created by Congress, then given a mandate. Here's what we need you to do. But Congress isn't full of specialists on environmental policy, so it's a broad mandate. And then it's up to the president to create the EPA and to staff it. And then it's up to the EPA to carry out its mandate in specifics. We call these regulations. But let's say the EPA creates a regulation that Congress is angry about. And the EPA says, well, we're just trying to fulfill our mandate to clean up the airways and the rivers and the waterways, et cetera, et cetera. What can Congress do? Well, Congress can pass a joint resolution to overturn that regulation from the EPA. They don't do this very often, again, because of lack of capacity and also lack of expertise in Congress. The fact is that Congress doesn't have the kind of environmental expertise that the EPA does. So it doesn't happen very often, but they have the capacity to do that. So that would be a check on the EPA. And particularly on the president, because the president is the direct line for the EPA. But there are agencies, bureaucratic agencies, independent regulatory agencies, for example, think like the alphabet soups, like the FTC, that kind of stuff, which are less under the control of the president. And that makes it difficult to really know which offensive and defensive weapons should be used by the different branches to curb the power of the FTC or the FCC or whatever, because the president is not directly does not directly have control of these independent regulatory agencies. They're kind of separated from the political institutions in that way. So that's an example of how you control agencies. But one other thing I will say is you don't get agencies out of nowhere. They don't just like crop up. They come mostly because of lobbying, that people say, hey, we want this agency to do these things. This is what we want it to do. And then it does what bureaucracy does, and it naturally gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful. And as you have the rise in agencies, you see a concomitant rise in interest groups, and it just kind of fuels each other. So again, my answer is, if you're angry about the administrative state and its massive size, look to Congress.
Interesting. How do you think that we've allowed the executive branch to gain so much power over the years? Because I mean, I think it's pretty well known that the executive branch has grown extremely. And the president has great amount of power, as you mentioned earlier about the executive orders and stuff. Could you just touch upon how we've allowed that pretty much to happen, even with
Yes.
checks and balances?
Yes. So you're not gonna be able to see this, but if I were to draw American history, it would look like this: presidential power, congressional power, presidential power, executive power, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We have swings, and the top of executive power are those presidents everyone can name, right? Lincoln, potentially our most powerful president ever, swinging back to a bunch of no-name, who cares about them presidents for the next 40 years. Then you get TR and Wilson, little swing back. Then you get FDR. We don't swing anymore. We don't really have these big dramatic swings back to Congress. Our weakest presidents are still historically remarkably powerful presidents. How did we get there? That's a great question. How did we get to this point? Well, there's a lot of answers, and I think one is emergency. Presidents are more powerful in situations, in crisis situations. For example, Lincoln is powerful only because of a civil war. He was actually a Whig. He opposed executive power before that. FDR is remarkably powerful because of the dual crisis of the Great Depression and World War II. So it's in moments of crisis that presidents become power, that they seize power. Crisis government is our norm now. Ever since the end of World War II, when we enter the Cold War era, that's permanent crisis. A potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union is permanent crisis. Presidents are powerful. Every time there is an economic disaster, crisis, we look to presidents to solve it. So I think the first answer is that crisis, particularly in foreign policy, has made presidents more powerful. We don't swing back because we don't leave crisis. And I think a second answer is the growth in the size of government. The more government does, the more it must administer. And that is the role of the president. The president has gotten more powerful as government has grown, because the bureaucracy is underneath him for the most part. So I think those are the two big answers. And then third is that the American people have lost institutional knowledge. We've begun thinking not as institutionalists, but as presidentialists and as partisans. So we look to presidents to solve all of our problems. For example, presidents will campaign on things like, I am going to either make abortion fully legal or ban abortion. No, you're not. No, you're not. That's not your job. But we listen to this and we say, yeah, that's why I'm going to vote for that president. We now think they do more than they do, and then we're disappointed when they can't do those things, and we think the answer is a more powerful president who could do those things, which would have to be a remarkably unconstitutional president. So I blame the people, I blame crisis, and I blame the rise in the size of government for this.
I did want to mention too, whenever you were talking about those types of presidents, I was thinking about the ones that you mentioned, Lincoln, FDR, they were all during times of war as well. So I was gonna mention too, I think war has a big play in that. That was just a thought that rolled off the top of my head. But
Right. So again, crisis. Crisis can be domestic or foreign. If it's foreign, it's war, unless it's civil war. But that's it. It's economic disaster, it's social upheaval, or it's war. And often since the 1940s, it's all three.
very true. I wanted to touch upon one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which was whenever people bring up term limits for Congress people, you say it's elections. I'm just curious why then we created term limits for presidents if we believe elections is the checks and balances for.
Oh, this is a great question.
I was
This
just
is a great question. Yeah. Okay. So why didn't we have term limits for the president originally? Well, Alexander Hamilton talks about this. The point is you want the president to feel reliant, to keep on being beholden to the people in order to maintain that power. The fear is if you have a term limit, then the last 2 years of that term, the president will do, whatever they want, which they kind of do. So how did we change our mind on this? Well, there's theory, what Alexander Hamilton said, but there was also precedent, the Washingtonian precedent, which is you leave office, you walk away from power. Washington walked away. And no one successfully broke that precedent in American politics until FDR, who breaks it not once but twice, that precedent. And we go, oh, so that can happen now. And that seems scarier, having someone who stays in office that long, becomes that powerful, the god of the Democratic Party, and then dies, than what they could potentially do in their last 2 years. So then we get the 22nd Amendment. We have term limits. So the question is, should we do this for Congress? There's a lot of arguments to be made that we should do this for Congress, because it turns out we're really, really bad at kicking people out of office if they have the right letter next to their name. So maybe we should institute term limits. However, word of caution, if you institute term limits, what you lose is institutional knowledge among key senators and representatives, which means that will have to be compensated for by an increasingly powerful staff in Congress. Institutional knowledge has to go somewhere. So it will go to staff. And if you're fine with that, then that's an answer. There's trade-offs here, but I can see a real appeal to term limits.
well, thank you for your answers. I'd have a lot more, but I'm running short on time. So I appreciate your answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jonah and Jewel and Janine and Savannah. Great questions and discussion so far. And before I go to the audience questions, I want to recognize our students and teachers who are watching today. We want to welcome Pat Watkins with 20 students from Destiny Christian School, Dr. Gregory Culver with the Austin Peay State University, and Peggy and Paul Forster with students. So welcome to all of our teachers and students watching. We also want to give a shout out to Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. Las Vegas's KKVV airs Constituting America's Constitutional Chats podcast on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to all of our listeners listening in Las Vegas. So, Savannah, we've got so many audience questions. I'm going to start with Andrew K., who asks, don't checks and balances fall apart when one branch, for example, the executive, ignores another, judicial, since there's no enforcement mechanism? What would you say is the enforcement mechanism, or is there one?
Okay. So let's think about this. Presidents, sorry, I'm trying to think about how to respond to this. Presidents or institutions can't ignore the weapons used by another institution unless the American people are cool with that, unless we let them get away with it, basically. So, for example, could a president just ignore a Supreme Court decision? Just refuse to enforce it. Ignore the Supreme Court completely. No and yes. Yes, in that if the American people will allow it, president can get away with just about anything. If the American people will allow it. How would they not allow it? Impeachment. You impeach the president in that case. Well, this has only happened really once, and that was Lincoln, who kind of ignored. That's what he did. He ignored the Supreme Court until it was more beneficial for him to respond to them. So enforcement mechanisms require an immense amount of institutional willpower. If a president has fully overstepped the bounds, it would require something which we have never seen before, though we saw it in a limited way in the second Trump impeachment trial. You would need to see members of Congress thinking exclusively as institutionalists and not as partisans. In other words, you would need to see members of the Senate vote against a sitting president of their own party. And the first time that happened was Mitt Romney, actually in the first Trump impeachment trial, first time in our entire history. It's very hard to do that. But checks and balances work so long as there is institutional willpower and, equally as important, the American people watching and punishing institutions that don't push back, that lack that willpower. That's what you need. So as I said, you want them at war with each other. If they get too chummy, you've got problems.
Well, and the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." So at the end of the day, it is our responsibility. Gary Arnell says, it seems to me that the check on executive orders is actually the purview of the legislature. The executive branch can only execute on executive orders on legislation passed by the legislative branch. The problem is that the legislative branch has taken on far more responsibilities than those specified in Article 1, Section 8, in turn giving the executive a much larger territory over which to issue orders. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, so no, this is true. The executive orders are just the president telling the bureaucracy how to interpret and administer laws passed by Congress. And it's also true that Congress is now passing laws on a whole bunch of things that would not have been thought of in 1800. But in some way, that's also inevitable. I had a friend in grad school who used to say that everything went wrong with McCulloch versus Maryland. Everything went wrong with the doctrine of implied powers. That's where everything went wrong. But without the doctrine of implied powers, you don't have a government that can respond, that can adapt, that can change to new circumstances. So I guess my answer here is, yeah, government has gotten bigger for better or for worse because situations have changed, because society has changed and gotten infinitely more complex than it was in 1800, for better or for worse. And that makes the president more powerful, which means if you still want checks and balances, you need to upgrade the powers of Congress in terms of oversight.
Well, thank you. Now, Mark Roberts says, I understand our founders distinguished our republic, especially from that of Rome, by submitting the military to civilian control. Would you comment on this decision as a significant check?
Oh, yes. Yes. This is an interesting one. Why have we never seen a military coup? Well, because it's a civilian administered military, but this actually goes back to what I call the Hannibal dilemma. And you can't Google that because I just came up with it. I'm calling it the Hannibal dilemma, which is how do you handle crisis? And in the Roman Republic, they handled crisis through a constitutional dictatorship. That's how they had perfectly constitutional. The Senate would step aside and appoint a dictator for a set amount of time who had not ultimate power, but a lot of power. He would solve the issue, such as Hannibal stomping through the north of what is now Italy and burning fields as he goes. That's a crisis. You hand power over to the executive. And then when the crisis is over, the Senate steps back up. Problem is that switch becomes difficult. And also, what happens when everything's a crisis? And soon, within a couple hundred years, you see the eradication of the Republic in favor of a Caesar who can handle crisis permanently. So what we tried to do is have a Congress and a presidency that coexist. One doesn't have to step aside for the other. They always coexist and they keep each other in check and in balance. And one of the ways to keep that presidency strong and importantly, limited and reliant on the people is a civilian military. By the way, the Anti-Federalists were not convinced by this. They didn't think it was enough. They were like, we have a standing army. We're all going to get killed. And the Federalist Papers' response was, yes, it's a standing army, meaning we're not going to rely on militias, but it's also a civilian army, right? It's always under the control of the presidency. So I'm quite happy about that decision, but it hasn't really come up much. We've never, not that I know of, maybe there hasn't, I don't know it, but we've never really had an instance where the military was about to overthrow the US government.
Well, and staying on the topic of the military and defense for a minute, you'd mentioned at one point, I think maybe when we were talking pre-show, about the defense authorization bill as a check on the commander in chief or on the president's ability to control the military. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that was a really interesting little known check.
Yes. Okay. So the National Defense Authorization Act, this funds the U.S. military, comes out of the Armed Services Committee, and it's like the one thing Congress can still do. If you see them fail to pass this bill, then Congress is well and truly broken, because it's still a mostly bipartisan process. But these NDAAs are massive, and they've got a bunch of stuff tucked in there. And the most interesting things that are tucked in the NDAA are foreign policy directives, basically requirements that force foreign policy in the United States one direction or another. It's a way that the United States Congress controls foreign policy is through its funding mechanism for the US military. It's totally fascinating. It's understudied and underappreciated, but scholars such as I was just at a conference where they spoke about this are beginning to look in the details of the NDAA to see, the Senate is still enforcing their will on foreign policy through the money.
Interesting. Now, in the time we have left, we have a couple of listeners who've asked about the 17th Amendment. Do you believe that the 17th Amendment weakened Congress's power? And also, it said, let's see, Leon Derby said, basically removing representation by the individual states and giving this power to parties.
So I think the 17th Amendment was inevitable. By the time you get to the passage of the 17th Amendment, state elections weren't about state policy. They were about who you would pick as senator. They had basically become senatorial elections, state elections. And frankly, there was a remarkable amount of corruption in the states as it related to the Senate. So I think it was an inevitable transition. I know other people strongly oppose the 17th Amendment to this day. It did decrease the power of states. That's true. It decreased the power of state governments, I should say. That's what it did in the United States Senate. But not necessarily the power of states, so long as those senators are still deeply tied to the people of their states. So I wouldn't get rid of the 17th Amendment, but I can see why people are grumpy about it.
Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating show, and I'm sure we could just talk to you for another hour, but we are right at time, and we just want to thank you so much for being our guest today. And we want to invite everybody back next week. It's going to be the day after the inauguration, and we're going to be talking about what the first day in a new White House is like with our special guest, the first White House press secretary in President Trump's previous administration, Sean Spicer. So Sean's going to be talking all about what it's like to walk into a brand new White House on day one and all the different things that take place on that first few days. So, Janine, any parting words?
Thank you, Savannah. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful. And
Thank
Jewel
you.
and Jorn and Jonah.
And we do encourage everybody to check out Savannah's podcast, This Constitution, and the Center for Constitutional Studies at Utah Valley University. So, thank y'all.
Thank you. Bye.
Knowledge is power.